on today's episode of The Mythic Masculine.
Myths are things that never happened but are always happening.
Mm.
So rather than just say, oh God, that was superstition 3,000 years ago, why bother? Why bother? No, the deep myths are archetypal, which means they are personifications of deep powers: lust, greed, violence, love, desire. All these forces in us, but also the forces of nature, have been personified, which means to put a face on, a mask on that's recognizable. So we tell stories about clouds. We also tell stories about the origins of marriage and Aphrodite and so on. And in a world which, again, arguably is becoming less and less culture bound and community bound, more and more loneliness. We know there's a rash of deep anxiety among youth. One of the links is, if you aren't reading, you do not know that other people have gone through this before. You begin to read and you realize you're not alone.
What does it mean to be a man today? And what is masculinity reclaimed from the toxic paradigm of domination and empire? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential uncertainty, how can we draw upon the lens of mythopoetics to navigate the terrain of imaginal possibility? This podcast explores the historical, cultural, and contemporary voices that are once again realigning masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. I'm your host, Ian McKenzie. Right now, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is storming around the world, a $1.3 billion phenomenon that has returned one of humanity's oldest stories to the center of our cultural conversation. My guest today is a man who has been steeping in this epic for years. Phil Cousineau is the author of the newly published The Wisdom of the Odyssey and more than 40 other books, including the best-selling The Art of Pilgrimage and The Hero's Journey, Joseph Campbell on his life and work. Phil is a writer, teacher, and storyteller who has consulted on myth and story for Warner Brothers, Pixar, and Lucasfilm. He's led mythology travel programs to Greece for more than 3 decades and hosted the PBS television series Global Spirit. In our conversation today, Phil invites us to look at why the Odyssey has risen once again. He suggests the epic poem is Western culture's first articulated case of PTSD and the consequence of war and conquest. We speak of the women who guide Odysseus back to himself, the terror of crossing your own threshold after 20 years away, and what it means when love rather than fame becomes glory becomes the gravity that pulls a man home. Phil reminds us that the Odyssey is everybody's story, and the courage required to bend down and kiss the earth in gratitude for the chance to begin again. Now, before we begin, you're invited to check out my website, The Mythic Masculine, to explore upcoming in-person and online offerings, as well as how to become a paid Substack supporter. This podcast is a true labor of love, and I've never accepted advertising. Instead, I rely on listeners like you to fund the show. If you've found insight and wisdom from my conversations, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Visit themythicmasculine.com for more details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Phil Cousineau. Welcome, Phil, to the show.
Thank you. It's great to feel this connection with Canada all over again.
Beautiful, because I understand, though you live in the U.S., you have a connection to Quebec, and maybe we could start there.
Yeah, sure. According to the family lore and now the different ancestry programs, my distant ancestor, Jean-Baptiste Cousineau, left the Périgord region in France around 1678 and went to Quebec. And my wife has done some research to say Jean-Baptiste is one of the 9 founding families of Montreal, or Montreal, as we would say growing up. So that's one connection. And the other is that I grew up with knowing my great-grandfather, Charlemagne Cousineau, who lived just across the Detroit River in Windsor for the first, maybe till I was 10 or so. A very mythic character because he was a fabulous storyteller. And he and my grandfather Horace described how they both worked the rails, pushing themselves on the old Gandhi dancers from Ontario all the way out to British Columbia. And they both would work in the mines. They worked as chefs. And then Charlemagne was one of the great voyageurs. He would paddle then up to the Yukon, and in some family traditions, then there were different routes, river routes, to go all the way back to Ontario. So I grew up with this whole notion of adventure, traveling, and storytelling. They were always inextricably connected with me. So when I grew up in Detroit in the 50s, I'm realizing now we must have been one of the last families, at least in North America, to read books out loud together. Everybody, all the French, for every family event, everybody was telling stories constantly. No phones were out. Oh my gosh. Everybody was a storyteller or a singer. And then my father began this tradition when I was around 10 of reading the classics. He would pick Homer. So we read YA versions early on. Then as the years went by, more and more sophisticated versions of Homer, but also Grimm's fairy tales, Huckleberry Finn, Canadian folk tales. This was all wrapped up. So by the time I got to college, it wasn't an affectation. It wasn't an escape from modern life for me to begin to combine my early education with writing at the University of Detroit, one of the great journalism schools in America at the time, and the whole study of folklore. So when I began traveling around the world in the mid 70s, I had a practice already in place that I picked up from my father. I've continued it, and now I recommend it to my students and my readers, in which you read. That is the beginning of all education, reading, storytelling. But then, as my father taught us, you read and then you make some kind of physical trip, a pilgrimage at best, to the site. So, for example, we're reading the Odyssey, and my father learns about an exhibition at the Met in New York City on Greek armor and sculpture. So we pile into the Ford station wagon on a Friday, drive all night long, take about 24 hours, spend the weekend in New York City going to the museums, and then we talk about this on the way home. In some way, I'm still doing this when I lead my art and literary and myth tours to Ireland, to France, even Cuba, but mostly Greece over the years. So I encourage everyone to read, and then we go to the sites we've read about. And then the third element is then to talk about these things. The phrase I came up with where I worked with Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of myth for many years, was a variation on Harvard's idea of the great conversation. If you read these 100 books, you don't even have to go to university. You can consider yourself educated. My version with Campbell over 8 years was the long conversation. So if you and I have a beer in Vancouver, we would spend maybe 15 seconds of small talk. And then I would ask you, what are you reading? Oh, I heard there was a death in your family. I hear you're getting married. When you dip into these eternal issues, you're in what I have been using now for 40 odd years, the great conversation. And guess what? I've learned over teaching all around the world, leading my tours, people are longing for a long conversation, to get past the superficial and to get down, as Ray Charles would have sung, down to the soul. Get down to the real thing. Get down to the real soul.
Oh, beautiful. It sounds like then myth, storytelling was in your blood, in your upbringing, and become a devotion, a lifelong devotion. And
well, that's wonderful. I like that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Therefore, I mean, you made the link beautifully to the Odyssey, which is, of course, the center of our conversation today. And, we're going to link it, of course, I think, to the film that's currently, making, I checked just today, $1.3 billion, a global phenomenon. And I wonder first to ask to sketch out for the listener, for those who, again, maybe they've heard about it, maybe they've seen the film, but they don't quite know the historical specifics about the Odyssey. I'd love for you just to sketch that out before we wade deeper into this long conversation.
Well, thank you. That's a very good idea. Should have been doing this all along. I can assume too much, despite the fact that the Homer doublet of the Iliad and the Odyssey is there in the cultural DNA. That's one way I think about myth in modern terms. It's in our cultural DNA. We're born with it. We have a deep response to certain archetypes. If you are of a Jungian bent, we respond to heroism. We respond to descents into the underworld to come back resurrected. That's part of the hero's journey, and it's part of every novel we read now. It's in every movie and so on. This is a story that goes back about 3,000 years, roughly. The original story took place in probably 8 books, and we have 2 left in our time, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But there were stories about the origin, the judgment of Paris, different offshoots about the Trojan War, and then the aftermath, even of Odysseus's life when he comes back to Ithaca. We remember too. What's important and fun and entertaining, and in the end, deeply moving to modern people, is that his story is our story. As Bob Dylan, when he accepted his 2016 Nobel Prize for Literature, he has this beautiful passage right in the middle of his acceptance speech, which cuts to the deep, deep resonance we feel for the story. He says, Odysseus was a traveling man, which sounds like a line from one of his songs. And he went through many ordeals. He went through many struggles. He had to fight monsters, and he had to fight seductive women. Pause. Then Dylan adds, a lot of these things have happened to you. Now, right there, you've got the mysterium tremendum, the mystery of plays, short stories, novels, and modern movies. For us, it begins with an enchantment. I write in my book, The Wisdom of the Odyssey, you can think of the Odyssey especially like 3-act structure from Aristotle. We're still using it all these centuries later. It begins with an enchantment. There's a beauty contest on Mount Olympus. The goddess Eris, she's the goddess of strife and trouble and doom. She's not invited, so of course she comes and exacts her revenge with a little ball that the listeners might remember from some of the fairy tales like Cinderella and some Sleeping Beauty and some. She rolls the ball along the marble floor of Mount Olympus, and it rolls to the feet of Zeus. And he bends down, he looks, and he sees the ominous phrase, for the most beautiful. Now, as any guy knows, with your wife looking over your shoulder, you dare not get into this. So instead, he asks Hermes to find a young guy somewhere in the world below to make the judgment. And it happens to be Paris, who's a prince of Troy. He's been exiled because there was a prophecy by Cassandra. Now, there's a name everybody knows in the modern world. And she says, Paris will be the doom of Troy. So Paris is living all alone, 17 years old, roughly. It's a good mythic masculine age, right? 17, 18 years old, Hera and Aphrodite. The first 2 goddesses, they try to bribe him. Oh, we'll make you famous. We'll make you sexy. We'll make you the greatest warrior of all time. He could care less. Aphrodite appears to him and drops her robe. Now, this isn't a pornographic image. It's an image strictly of the way that Aphrodite embodies desire, which, according to the ancient Greeks, is one of the engines of human existence. It's the desire to find yourself. It's the desire to find beauty in the world. And then she comes up with a line that I think helps unpack the whole mythic magnificence of the Odyssey. She says, if I give you the hand of Helen of Sparta, the face who launched 1,000 ships, I will also guarantee she falls in love with you. This is a really mysterious line, because what it starts to set up is the fact that the Greeks are saying love is beyond will. If you do not will yourself to fall in love with X, Y, or Z, there's an outside force, and it's called enchantment. Enchantment is at the heart of Homer. We are enchanted to go to war. We are enchanted to be married. We're enchanted or cast a spell by stories themselves. So the moment Helen and Paris meet in Sparta, where Helen's husband has left for a weekend, Paris then takes her back to Troy. And then we can flip forward into a really, really interesting element of this. The Greeks are alarmed that the wife of their great general Menelaus has been abducted. Now, there are different verbs used with this, But what's interesting is that they had all made a pact, an agreement under Odysseus's idea. This was his idea, knowing how beautiful she was. Think about this even in modern impact, the way that men are seduced in business, in government, in sport, the sporting world, by beauty, by sex, by desire. Odysseus knows on some level this is going to happen. So he says, if someone comes and makes trouble with Helen, we will all band together. There's all the generals all across ancient Greece, and we will go get her back. It's a really interesting literary device, a narration device. So when the word goes out, as we know, 1,156 ships go to Troy to try to get Helen back. So many people in the modern world will say, did this really happen? Okay. And that's an issue that Christopher Nolan has to deal with in his book. So a brief allusion to this. One, on the historical level, there were a number of campaigns where the ancient Greeks, or their 250 tribes, which eventually became modern Greece, they knew that Troy was the richest city in antiquity. Why? Because it was right there on the entrance to the Bosphorus Straits, which go into the Black Sea, past modern Istanbul. And the Greeks, the ancient Trojans, levied taxes and tariffs, which meant they had more gold in their coffers than anybody. So on one level, this is probably an allegory for what happens when one country is lusting after the resources, let's say oil today, or the fame, the money itself, which is happening with the Straits of Hormuz and so on and so on. But it's also a psychological allegory. Albert Camus, one of the great existentialist writers, said, we all fight for money and glory. The Greeks died for beauty. So you get an entrance into the Greek soul here, that they were willing to go to war to bring Helen back to Greece for the sake of beauty. So the war rages for 10 years, as most people around the world know because of Nolan's film. It was savage. The Odyssey is the story of the aftermath of the Trojan War. And by that, I mean, like in the New Yorker cartoon, was this guy really a great general, a great navigator? Because look at his route. He goes this way, he gets lost. He gets blown off course, he goes this way. He's going from Sardinia to Africa, back. He's all over. What the heck does that possibly mean if he's such a great general? In my book, The Wisdom of the Odyssey, I'm arguing he's history's first case of PTSD. He has been savaged, not by a few months of war, but by 10 years of war. And someone who needs healing, as we know, working with veterans, war veterans, there is no straight bead home. If a soldier goes straight back home after war, a deep conflict, there will be trouble at home. Most likely violence in the home. We can't deny this anymore. Returning soldiers without therapy, without some kind of counseling, tend to still be violent for a long time. So this book is the case. I'm arguing Odysseus is a lost soul. He's lost his soul at war, which is a very different story. He's not the great adventurer. He's not Arnold Schwarzenegger in a toga, right? He's not a bullying man full of testosterone who is willing himself back home to Ithaca. Instead, the Ithaca homecoming, that's what the book was probably called in antiquity, homecoming, is a story of anguish. We have our word nostalgia. It's actually got Greek origins. Nostos is home or homecoming. Algia is pain. So here's one for the mythic masculine movement. The deep sense of nostalgia is the pain of going home again. Or as the ancient Greeks would have said, not bittersweet, but they said sweet bitter. It's sweet to try to go home, maybe to relive our glory days on the football field, maybe to go home to see an ex-girlfriend, or to meet our grandparents. But in truth, people the world over for 3,000 years have been set on fire by this image of how hard it is to go home again. Home may not even exist anymore if you've been gone for 20 years like Odysseus, or they won't recognize you when you go home, and you probably will not recognize home. So how do we deal with this? Odysseus needs, as my friend Ed Tick, who's one of the great counselors for PTSD in the world, in the world right now, says, Odysseus then on his long way home, he needs 7 years with Calypso, which is one of the most interesting scenes in Nolan's film. Why 7 years? Well, it's a mythic number. It's a number of return and completion, like 7 days of the week. But it's also a number of incubation. So her name in Greek means hide or conceal. So we're dealing with a war veteran who shipwrecks on an island, and there's a goddess there who loves him. Love is one of the big healing factors in PTSD, the healing of a deep, deep wound. It's not just talk therapy. It's not just going back to work and getting your life together. You need incubation. You need a place to feel safe so that you can heal again. And so just to end then, what happens, we have 12 adventures. Again, it's a mythic number. And Odysseus, for me, maybe the most important chapter in my book, chapter 9, is when Odysseus is on the magical island of Phaeacia. And he hears, as part of the code of Xenia, hospitality, the king and queen bring in a bard who begins to sing a song to entertain their guest, Odysseus, who's in disguise. And the bard begins to sing about the Trojan War. And our hero, this startles a lot of modern people, our hero begins to weep. And the king says, have we done something to offend you? We fed you, we bathed you, we anointed you. Now we're entertaining you, but you're crying. What's wrong? And the classic line, he says, I am Odysseus of whom you sing. My fame is far flung. I now would like to tell you my story from my point of view. And in my book, I say, this is the moment the warrior, someone who's lived by virtue of violence for nearly 20 years, he begins to tell a story. And as Van Morrison likes to sing, and the healing has begun. This is a message for your movement with the Mythic Masculine movement and most modern audiences. We begin to channel the violence, channel the hatred, channel the impulse to war when we take our story back and we begin to tell our story.
Thank you for that whirlwind journey through so much of that context. I appreciated the before as well, of course, as Nolan's film also opens. I believe it's close to the beach, and the horses there pretty soon after. I'm curious then, ask around, and you're touching on it already, which is, I have a sense when I track pop culture and movies have been a love of mine as well, particularly Nolan's work for some time, all the way back to Memento. I was tracking his early work, so it's kind of fascinating to see his rise as well. And I'm curious for you, there's also this sense that myths themselves have their own agency, right? Martin Shaw, who I also collaborate with, the great storyteller, myth teller from Wales, he speaks about this as well, that myths, they have their own agency. They can be promiscuous. They can rise at different times. And I believe as well through film, of course, is one of the most significant mediums we have to project, stories across the globe. There's something, I think, unique about this moment beyond Nolan's preference. I don't know specifically what got him about the Odyssey, why he wanted to do it. But I also believe there's a sense of an intelligence working through the artists that they may not, they don't understand or fully anticipate. But I wonder for you, as you track the rise again of the Odyssey now, again, why do you think it's has risen again? And what is the link to this present moment?
What a beautiful question, beautifully phrased. Thank you for that, Ian. Let me begin with a haunting idea from James Baldwin, one of my favorite writers, the African-American writer, memoirist, playwright. He was interviewed in 1963 by Life magazine, a legendary journal. And they were asking him, like you might have asked Martin Shaw, what's the function of story? Why do we write? Why do we read? Why do we tell stories and so on and so on? And very reflectively, Baldwin says, and this is a close to exact quote, just when you think that your pain and your heartache is unprecedented in the history of the world, that no one else has ever possibly felt what you have felt, comma, one of the great commas of all time, then you read. And Baldwin goes on to say, for a long time in his youth, he thought that he was the only one who went through his assortment of terrors and anxieties, but the more he read, the less alone he felt. Since you asked, I feel that's part of the phenomena right now around the return to myth, which began arguably with my mentor, Joe Campbell, who I worked with for 8 years. I wrote the film and the book, The Hero's Journey. And now, once again, with Nolan's work. Why would that be? A helpful place to allude to is an old Roman saying that I have brought into our time. Myths are things that never happened, but are always happening. So rather than just say, oh God, that was superstition 3,000 years ago, why bother? Why bother? No, the deep, deep myths are archetypal, which means they are personifications of deep powers, lust, greed, violence, love, desire. All these forces in us, but also the forces of nature, have been personified, which means to put a face on, a mask on, that's recognizable. So we tell stories about clouds. We also tell stories about the origins of marriage and Aphrodite and so on. And in a world which, again, arguably is becoming less and less, how can you say, culture bound and community bound, more and more loneliness. We know there's a rash of deep anxiety among youth. Record numbers of suicides in certain cultures around the world. One of the links is, if you aren't reading, you do not know that other people have gone through this before. Being banished to war, your husband leaving you for the secretary, embezzlement in the office place. These are all archetypal situations. You begin to read and you realize you're not alone. This makes you, what's the old phrase, one with all of the world. So we find solace when we go to see Casablanca, Citizen Kane, Groundhog Day. Oh, when you do one of these slaps, oh my God, I went through that. I went through a period of my life where I thought the same thing was happening day after day after day, like in the Bill Murray character. The Odyssey is everybody's story. You name it. The source of human emotion, human interaction, nearly every situation has been packed into those 12,106 lines, something like that. So that when you read, you feel some light is being shed into your own story. Just an example, I'm wearing an Odyssey sweatshirt to a local cafe here in San Francisco just a couple of weeks ago. And a fellow walks up to me and shakes my hand. And he says, oh, I know who you are. And congratulations on your book. I heard you on the radio. I just want to shake your hand because I read the book, well, the Odyssey, 40 years ago in high school, and I've never forgotten it. So being an ex-journalist, I said, what was it that you liked then? And what do you remember? And he said, I remember seeing myself in the book as a teenager. I think, oh my God, that's part of the genius of this. Can you see yourself in the Eugene O'Neill play? Can you recognize yourself in the Lillian Hellman play about the battle between the sexes? Can you see yourself in the movie? It's one way we learn to recognize ourselves. And Dame Edith Hall, a great classicist out of London, says of this moment that I just alluded to, when Odysseus hears his story from someone else, from a bard, a singer with a lyre, at that moment, he knows who he is. And she says, this is the first example in Western history, at least the history of literature that we know of, in which someone becomes fully human conscious. Now, what does she mean? Is we only know ourselves in relation to other people's stories. So what did you go through in your divorce? What happened to you at war? What happened to you when you had your first child? When we begin to pair up our stories with other human stories, which is one of the great functions of myth, fairy tale, folklore, we know ourselves in a way that other people can't. If your only version of yourself is through your own story, you have a two-dimensional view rather than, let's say, a three-dimensional view. And for that reason, it's one reason why I began teaching the use of mythology at the American Film Institute in Hollywood in the early 1980s. And it was astonishing. My teaching partner at the time, Tom Schlesinger, and later Chris Vogler, who many people would know because of his book, The Writer's Journey. In the early 80s, we began teaching at the Louis B. Mayer Theater, 900 people capacity, audience capacity, talking about the myth behind Pandora's Box, the Pabst film, or The Wizard of Oz, Apocalypse Now, Casablanca, the film noir phenomena. We would show clips, and then we would talk about the myth underneath, and then the myth underneath that. And it was astonishing to show people about the story within the story within the story. Just one brief example on that is Apocalypse Now, which some people now regard as the greatest American movie, even better than The Godfather, possibly, even more important than Citizen Kane and so on. And the story within the story is based on a screenplay by John Milius, who modeled it after Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Conrad based Heart of Darkness on Homer's Odyssey. So you've got a kind of jack in the box here. You've got this story that's not just about Vietnam, the movie, it's about all war. How do you tell a story, a movie? It's something so phenomenally ungraspable. You've got to go back to the beginning. And I think that's part of the modern, the model here, like Groundhog Day we alluded to, is actually based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now, you don't need to know that to really laugh at the movie and identify with it. But I would argue, and I do in my book, that the movies that deeply resonate with you, make you angry or make you laugh uproariously, like a Marx Brothers movie, are all based on old models that have been there probably since the Paleolithic caves.
Well, this is really rich. And, you know, what's coming to me in particular, I mean, I know you said the Odyssey can be seen as the story of so many modern people in these days. And in particular, I think an important lens to see it through the eyes of men and masculinity. Christopher Nolan, you know, is generally seen as a very masculine filmmaker. The Oppenheimer film that came out, in contrast to the Barbie film, you know, a few years ago, was very much a contrast of that. The Barbie was a very feminist film, and Nolan, I remember reading reviews that were, you know, it's a very strong masculine film. And the Odyssey film itself also seems to be, I mean, yes, there are female characters, but of course the lion's share goes to the male characters in the film and their journey. I mean, particularly Odysseus. And there's something in the journey of the men that I also recognize. And of course, I work with a lot of men and myth, and that there's something in this sense of a commitment to a heroic purpose that a lot of men have or you know, conditioned into. And then the achieving of that purpose, in this case, the fall of Troy, and then the journey home for Odysseus, and of course, all of the adventures and side quests along the way, and also the grief of that. And I was just reading very recently, actually, an article in The Guardian, which you may have come across, which it's a men's therapist. And what he talks about is, he says that a lot of men enter midlife or come to him around midlife or late midlife, and they've achieved what they set out to do. You know, they have a career, they have a house, they have a family, but there's an inexplicable grief in them. And they don't quite know how to do with it, the men. And dare I say, the author in this case of that essay, he's, again, a men's therapist. He doesn't say in the way that perhaps Robert Bly might have said, or perhaps Joseph Campbell might have said, that that's an entry into a different kind of contact with soul that is a man's work at the time, that grief, in fact, is the kind of way in the undercurrent versus a problem to solve, per se. So I just wonder about you as you look at the Odyssey. What is it saying, or is it reflecting back on the journey of men and a man in particular today?
Beautifully, beautifully articulated. I can tell you have been wrestling with this for a long time. And I appreciate how you condensed and compressed your thoughts, but also your encounters with fellow men on this. So thank you. Just for the record, remember, I worked with Campbell for 8 years. I worked with Bly for even longer.
Mm.
With him, Michael Mead early on, John Densmore. I worked with Densmore on his book about the Doors. I worked with Robert Johnson for many years. Remember his book on romantic love? We lectured
Mhm.
together around the world. Robert Moore, I worked with for years. So this has been my bailiwick for a long time. And in this yet, I think I've upped the ante with this one because something new, I feel new and important, has come to me by virtue of taking people to the actual Homeric sites in Greece. It's a different experience than having, let's say, lectured, talked about it all in a classroom in San Francisco or New York or even Vancouver. When we're at the site, something different happens. And this is part of my message in The Art of Pilgrimage, probably my biggest book, 15 languages or so, available all around the world. And that's the pilgrimage is the journey you can't take. You feel the double negative in that? You reach it, you can't talk to your best buddy anymore about it. You can't talk to a therapist isn't helping you anymore. For I'm saying 60,000 years using the Aborigine walkabout as one of the earliest examples of pilgrimage, we go to these sacred sites, not any neutral site, not a vacation site. We go to a sacred site because things happen there that don't happen at home. This is a way to acknowledge that we have to get out of our heads sometimes. So it just came to me, out of our heads and back into our feet. We actually walk to these sites. Pilgrim means, it comes from per agram, you're crossing the fields. You are walking to these sites. Walking helps to loosen up our minds, our thoughts, but also our hearts, and I argue our souls. So it's at these sites with people, often in deep grief, who take my journeys to Ireland, to France, especially to Greece, because there's something undealt with there. And I think the Odyssey speaks to people because it's a book about the grief of going home again. Realizing we've changed, home has changed, our family has changed. Maybe our wife won't even recognize us after we've come home from war. That's what the whole symbolism of the threshold is about. Remember Bly, you mentioned Bly. Bly has this great poem, What Have You Got? What have you got to get past the threshold guardians? Do you remember that? Robert would
Mhm.
get really feisty about this because the threshold, crossing the threshold in through your front door into the palace of Odysseus on Ithaca, means there are huge forces trying to keep you back. So I have found in this book something surprising. And that helped fuel me to write this book in a record amount of time because I had to get the book out before the movie and the worldwide phenomenon would happen. And it's this: Odysseus is not one of our archetypal heroes who, through sheer dint of Nietzschean will, forces his way home because he's courageous, because he's strong, even because of his almost legendary endurance. That's part of it. I think the one word that would summarize the Odyssey is endure. He tells Calypso this. He tells Penelope later, I will endure. He talks to himself once and he says, bear up, heart. A really interesting line for a man to tell himself. Bear up, keep moving, keep going. So there's that. We know he's clever. He's called the wisest of the Greeks. He's called the greatest strategist. He's also, this is important for me, to understand him and to give advice to our fellow men in grief, in deep anxiety. Polytropos is the way that Homer famously describes him on page 1. Polytropos means many turns or twists and turns. I know Emily Wilson recently translates that as complicated, which is fine, but I don't think it gets to the mystery. What it means is this is a man who can change his mind. This is colossal. Many men get to midlife and they cannot change their mind. They can't change their ideas anymore. So we've got a hero who's taking 10 years to go home, and he finds he cannot get back to Ithaca unless he changes the way he thinks about himself. unless he changes the way he thinks about life and the gods. So in a capsule, the Iliad is a book in which, again, you have to be careful about the figures and so on. 60 to 70% of the interactions in the Iliad are about the gods or influenced by the gods. The gods are everywhere. Even in a battle, Athena or Aphrodite can appear as a cloud and deflect a spear. So they are all over. And I agree with the scholars who say this reflects a time which is deeply mythological, where human free will isn't that much of an issue yet. By the time I think the young Homer, or I say the poet known as Homer, which is neutral, gets to the Odyssey, he's an older man. And he does not glorify war like he did as a young man in the Iliad. And in the Odyssey, I think we're finding the deep movement between mythology and philosophy, between the male who was bullying his way in every sense of the word bull. Great essay by James Hillman on this, by the way. The whole symbolism of bullshit, bullying our way through life. And his hero in the Odyssey, who is beginning to think for himself for the first time. He's the first thinking hero. James Joyce was interviewed after he wrote Ulysses, which was based on Homer's Odyssey, one day in the life of a man in Dublin. And he writes, he thinks Homer's Odysseus is the first complete human being. That's an enormous thought. Here's one aspect of it, which I think can be really helpful for your own wonderful and crucial movement with the mythic masculine. It's this. What Homer is pointing out, possibly because he also had a lot of women in his audiences at the time. Women were usually invisible in ancient Greece, but they would come to the storytelling festivals. They would come to the palaces, the competitions, the festivals where the first plays, the first poems were being recited. So I'm thinking Odysseus had to keep in mind the women who were in the audiences. So what happens? I'm making the argument in my book. Odysseus reaches home because he's strategic, he's cunning, he's shrewd, he's strong, but it's also because of 6 women in the book. This is rarely commented on. Now, in one way, you could say, Robert Johnson would say, he's accessing his anima. Well, that only goes so far because something else is happening. It's Athena, he's his patron goddess, who appears every time he's in trouble or about to make a stupid decision. But there's also Calypso, who hides him just long enough for him to heal. This is important for men, to be safe for a while, and then to be healed by unconditional love. When the trauma is so deep, thinking cannot get us to the answer. We need that deep love. And later, Circe is the one who actually steers him, gives him navigational instructions. Steer on the raft between Orion on one side and the Great Bear on the other. Nausicaa, Euryclea, the maid at home, and then, of course, Penelope. And why is Penelope strong? Here's something for you guys to talk about in your next conference. Besides all the glory in the book, I argue that Western literature's first example of a thought of suicide takes place 2/3 of the way through the Odyssey. Odysseus is there. Poseidon has ruined his raft one more time. And Odysseus clings to, as Homer says, the last sliver of wood from the rudder. It's a huge mythic image there. And he almost lets go. He almost lets go. Now just think, you and me, we go off on an adventure. We go to Yosemite, we go to Vietnam, wherever we go, with 165 fellow crewmen. All Odysseus has lost his entire crew. There are about 150,000 Greeks actually went to Troy. Most of them perished. You know the old phrase, every war has two losers. Did the Greeks really win at Troy? So here's the big question. For me, the mythic question, which rounds this up. Odysseus does not let go of the last splinter of wood. Why not? I put this out to all your listeners. In the future, if you want to play this back in your workshops, why do any of us hold on? Ian, why do we hold on? I'm arguing it's love. In the Iliad, it's Kleos, K-L-E-O-S, it's glory. You hang on, you go back into battle, even if, like John Cleese in Monty Python, just a flesh wound. Do you remember that? He's lost both arms, he's lost both legs. Yeah. He still wants to keep fighting. And his famous line, done in a falsetto, is, oh, just a flesh wound. This is part of the insanity of the Iliad. Going back again and again for what? The belief if you die in war, people will tell your story for the rest of eternity. They will always talk about your home runs or your sexual conquests or how much money you made in the world. You know what Homer is saying, we die because of this mythic hunger for fame, glamour. In the Odyssey, it's matured. Odysseus chooses life again and again versus death. This is timeless. And I think it's one reason why war veterans love the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's a mirror of what they've gone through, where part of you, when you're very young, you will die for your country, for no questions asked. You will die. And then you go into the underworld, and of course, Odysseus encounters Achilles in the underworld. And he's like a high school kid meeting his favorite baseball player. Suddenly you're 12 years old all over again, right? And you're just talking with a falsetto like John Cleese. And Odysseus says, it's true. I know you died young, and that has its problems to die when you're 22. But I want to let you know, we're still telling your story. Everybody tells your story, Achilles. It was worth it. Achilles looks at him. Many scholars feel this is the axis mundi, the point, the whole myth turns around. Achilles looks at him, and I'm paraphrasing now, but he says, you moron, which is an old Greek word for fool, by the way. You fell for that crap about the glory of dying young? And then in his beautiful line, he said, in effect, I would give up all of that fame, all of that glory for one more day of sunshine in the overworld. So we are reading, to come full circle to your wonderful question, we are reading, now viewing in the movie, the shift between the unquestioned hero's journey, I will do anything to be heroic and be remembered as a hero, to something I think is much more mature, which Joseph Campbell told me he wanted to write about if he had years left, but he died before he could rewrite The Hero with a Thousand Faces. But he knew there was a different myth for men in middle age and afterwards in the elder years. So Odysseus is finding it much harder to go home. As a lot of guys, I'm sure men are coming to your workshops. They can't go home again. They can't talk to their wives. Most men don't have many male friends anymore. So when we talk about the archetype of going home, what is it? What is home? If we don't have friends and we can't talk to our wives and our kids, what is home? The Odyssey is reworking this out for us. And the difference, I think, and it's open for discussion, of course, Odysseus is pulled back home by Eros. That's the deep, deep archetypal force that's there at the beginning of creation. So he's going home because of love. The Penelope's love is very palpable in the Odyssey, but it's also the land. You and I have already talked a little bit about my family is from Canada. And every time I go to Canada, something shakes, rattles, and rolls in me. There's something archetypal if I'm stepping foot in Canada again. I go to Greece, something shakes in me like an earthquake. Ithaca is pulling Odysseus home. The fact he has never met his son, and he's wondering, there's no internet. He doesn't even know if his son is alive. He's got to go back for his son, his parents, the beauty of nature itself. Henry David Thoreau said the world's first great nature writing is in the Odyssey. So to see where I'm going with this, rather than just bullying your way through, which is the Iliad, it's a book of horror in terms of battles, to a world in which Odysseus, in my life lesson in my book is let love pull you home. Most men will say, whoa, no, that's too sensitive. It's too feminine. As we used to say in Detroit, get back with your bad self. But the Odyssey, in some ways, is the world's first romance. It's saying one thing is going to get this guy home. One thing and one alone. It's not glory. It's not fame. And it's not even the desire for revenge. It's love in the deep sense of Eros.
Thank you. As you speak, I'm recalling the words of a Rumi poem, which I did read actually at our men's conference we held last week, which was, there was a line in it that said something like, nothing stirs without desire, something like that. And it's just so beautifully articulated by what you said, that the land itself calling Odysseus home, and to be stirred into that love, or to be animated by that love, I think is beautiful.
Whose translation? Was that Coleman?
Wasn't. It was a newer one, actually.
A newer one? Oh,
yeah. I'll find it too. I'll send it to you.
Please send that. That is an echo of what I'm talking about. It's not, I'm not arguing for a sappy Hollywood ending. Love brought him home again, and then everything was peachy keen, as Grandma used to say after that. No, this is a sense of deep eros, which is love and desire. It's a desire that keeps us going. I'm asking about Coleman because a few years ago I worked on a book, one of my favorite, Burning the Midnight Oil, because I've been a nighthawk all my life, like Edward Hopper's painting, a nighthawk. And I sent a note to Coleman Barks, the famous Rumi translator, who I've known for many years, and said, I really want to use another Rumi poem, but not the ones you translated before. They're so anthologized. Do you have something else? It was the last day of the fax machines. So a couple hours, I hear my fax machine whirring, and there are 13 newly translated poems of Rumi by Coleman Barks pouring through. He was so generous. Take them all. Don't pay me. I don't care. Just use something new. The first line of the first new Rumi poem is actually reflective of something powerful in the Odyssey I'm trying to bring home to readers. There's some of it in Nolan's film, not enough for me. And it says, he who does not praise daily is a thief. Oh, doesn't it hits you right here, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That's archetypal. It's not sentimental. It's not just up here with the frilly lights and so on. That's deep. And there's something in Homer about that. Odysseus is grateful for the opportunity to wash up on shore at Ithaca, smack dab in the middle of the book. The book is 24 chapters. He called them books or rhapsodes. And exactly in the beginning of book 13, the whole second half of the book is about homecoming. And he if readers remember the moment, it's shown pretty well in the movie. He washes up on shore, but then he's tired, he's exhausted, he's come home alone. He doesn't have his crew. He's lost all his ships. He looks around, he can't even recognize home. And a young boy passes by, and it's Athena in disguise. And Odysseus says something like, where am I? Right? The classic. Maybe that was the first time in literature anybody asked, where am I? And then Athena magically becomes herself again. There's so many of these gorgeous metamorphosis scenes. And she says, Odysseus, don't you recognize your own home? And when he realizes, he's looking around, a mist, Homer says, she drifted a mist onto the island, which is such a beautiful phrase. Why would she do this? She knows, you've probably dealt with this with a lot of the men who take your workshops and your conferences. That moment of crossing the threshold, coming home again, is mythical. It's outside of time and space. We have to be very careful what words we choose when we walk through the door. how we hold the people on the other side of the door, how we have to have sympathy for them, how they look at us because we've changed and so on. And at that moment, Homer describes Odysseus as bending down and kissing the beach. And again, this is a line right out of Rumi. Bend down and kiss the earth. There are so many different translations of this.
Mm-hmm.
What it's about is gratitude. This, I would argue, Odysseus is the first grateful male hero from antiquity. He is grateful for being alive. He's grateful his wife, eventually, that his wife has waited for him. He's grateful he has about 6 friends on an island that has turned against him. But he's grateful for this.
Yeah.
And this is one of the great, great, great gifts of Homer's Odyssey. It shows us that life has to be fought for. Fighting is, of course, a metaphor for holding on to what we love, protecting it. And as someone I worked with many years ago in a kind of a think tank, coming home to Ithaca is about restoration. Everything has changed. Life is mutable. Our relationships don't stay the same. Our home doesn't stay the same. Businesses come and go. Our favorite cafes, our favorite pubs come and go, come and go. How do we deal with this? Gratitude for what is. Gratitude. We can still catch a breath here and there, and grateful that love is there to call us home.
Maybe one last image too I would love to raise, which is around the version of Odysseus that comes back, of course, in the film. I think, and maybe it's also in the poem, but he's sort of he's told to not come in triumphant, and striding through the gates, and he'll be welcomed back with open arms and everything. I think it's a cautionary tale. I think because Agamemnon went through, he was brutally murdered. That's a side thing, but so for Odysseus, he comes back actually as a beggar. Right. And, I see that on the one hand as being, of course, it's a deception in some sense. He's trying to arrive before people, quote, know who he is. But there's something actually more about that, right? He's coming back deeply humbled. He's not coming back heroically striding, home again. That actually he comes, bent and listening, and which I would say diminished in a very significant way. But that diminishment is actually a deepening. It's not a devaluing.
Whew. Wonderful. Those are very compelling thoughts. A couple things come to mind. First is something in my other phase, my other work in film. I've been involved in over 50 films as well. I'm a consultant on myth in the movies for Warner Brothers, many studios. So I have to constantly wrestle with this. It's called Ebert's Law, as in Roger Ebert, the famous movie critic.
Uh-huh.
And he once said, judge a movie as an original work of art rather than an adaptation. Because if we're constantly thinking, oh, this isn't Jane Austen at her best, this isn't James Joyce or even Raymond Chandler, we all get stuck there. This is difficult because with this story, because the Odyssey is really a world heritage. It's Greek. It's primarily Greek. It's savage Greek. It's very strange. I should begin every talk and interview with this. It's a strange book in the sense it's full of what Campbell used to call the wonderland. So books 9 through 12 are all about the wonders. And people working with fairy tales and healing will use words like the green land, like the green man in mythology, the character with all the tendrils coming out of the hair. The healing has to be done in the green land, the wonderland, the kaleidoscopic land. So books 9 through 12, the Cyclops, Scylla and Charybdis, Circe with her magic morphine. This is Homer resorting to folktales in the middle of a book that has a lot of history in it. But the healing takes place in magic time. So what you're alluding to then becomes, I'm trying to set this up for what Nolan, in order to reach as many people around the world as a filmmaker, rather than just a strict mythologist, has to go wide. So he has to conflate characters. He has to compress and condense and choose. It's a great phrase, very simple. in the movie line where directors will say, "Oh, I like your choices, man." Actors will turn to each other, "Oh, love your choices there," right? And even screenwriters, "Oh, I loved your choice," which means you had to leave 6 characters by the wayside and choose 3 others here, bring them all together. What does this all mean here? Nolan makes an educated but also troublesome choice to motivate Matt Damon as Odysseus by saying he feels tormented and tortured for having come up with the idea of the Trojan horse, tricking the Trojans to get into the city, and then unleashing terror. The Greeks modern day Greeks are mortified by this. The ancient Greeks would have not recognized this at all. If you are a famous general, it means you are cleverer than the other general. You're cleverer than your own other generals. It's about strategy. How do you win? If you're taking 160,000 soldiers into war, you better be ready to strategize, which is an old Greek word for general, by the way. Strategos was a general. However, from Nolan's point of view, he's got to compress what would otherwise be a 9-part TV series. So he's trying to say that this made our great general, who's already been at war for 10 years, so riddled with shame and anxiety by the time he gets to Calypso's island, Calypso played by Charlize Theron, beautifully portrayed, that he has amnesia. He is so grief-stricken, he doesn't know who he is. He says, "Am I married? What happened to my men? Do I have a crew? Where have I been all these years?" And so then Nolan has to compress so much backstory and narration into these scenes. She does the work for him. And Matt Damon as Odysseus never becomes the great, great spellbinding orator he is in the book. So the audiences are losing a major thing here. What you get with Matt Damon is a good performance, but he's never eloquent. He is shy. He has been suppressed, thumbed down like tamping tobacco down into grandpa's pipe, right? So that he never says anything really interesting. He is so ingrown, you might say. And then what that does is it makes him shame-ridden, guilt-ridden about being a leader, about being a general, which is baffling because he's been considered. The Iliad and the Odyssey are taught in war schools like West Point to this day for a reason. Churchill would refer to Odysseus and his leadership qualities, but all that's gone in the movie because a little bit like Francis Ford Coppola with Apocalypse Now, Nolan is trying to talk, I think, about all war and the shame and the guilt that we carry if we're in battle at all. Mm-hmm. So you have to, does this work as a movie is basically it. Well, we get the point. He feels enormously horrible about the savagery. But remember, in the poem, it's Agamemnon who says, "Take no prisoners, burn Troy to the ground." It's not Odysseus. It's actually, Odysseus is the one then who is scarred. But in the poem, let's see if this makes a difference to the guys in your men's movement. Let's see if it's mythic or not. Homer would allude to the famous scene with the Cyclops, which is supposed to be a kind of, Zeus's law is hospitality, xenia. It means you are kind to people who knock on your door. If you're in a palace or if you live in a hut, a hovel, you have to feed people and even bathe them, wash their feet, which became later a Christian ritual. And then only after all that, then do you entertain them, maybe with songs, with dancers, whatever it might be. This is the glue that helped create the Greek Empire. Now, this will be startling for your listeners, but up until about the 19th century, roughly half of all travelers, soldiers, roughly half of all travelers, soldiers, merchants, philosophers, traders, never got home again. Your students, your audiences have to take that figure in. That's why it was so dangerous and risky to travel. If you left home, you better hug your wife goodbye. You might never see her again. 50-50 chance you will never see her, your children again, your parents again, your land again. So a code had to come about which made it safe to travel long distances. And if that's violated, there were no prisoners taken. Someone violates that law. If there's rape because you let a stranger in, that person would be dealt with. And that's at the heart of the Odyssey. Odysseus is hungry. His crew is hungry. They go into the cave of the Cyclops. They blind the Cyclops because he's begun to eat some of the soldiers, which is a terrible thing. But the Greek explanation of this is that Odysseus took pride in having blinded the Cyclops and then saying, tell them Odysseus, king of Ithaca, is the one who hurt you. This is a really important point to teach in your conferences, because accomplishment is one thing, but if men specifically begin to go around and say, you don't know who you're dealing with, man, or look, I get the credit for this in business, and I get the credit for this, and I am more glorious than the next guy. The Greeks called this hubris. Hubris is nearly always our downfall. And finally, just come full circle, which is important, the ending of Nolan's film works somewhat, just in terms of a huge Hollywood blockbuster. The king and queen have a few moments together, but then something that's very unlikely in the Greek philosophy, the Greek mythology. Anne Hathaway, Matt Damon, Penelope, and Odysseus get on a boat and they sail away into the sunset. That is not a Greek ending. It's not even satisfying for me anyway. As a filmmaker, it's more like an American Western. It's like John Wayne bringing Natalie Wood home at the end of The Searchers, the John Ford movie, based on the Odyssey, by the way, getting on his horse and riding into the sunset. It is a strictly American mythology of male strength. I don't need nobody is a phrase that's often used in American Western movies. I don't need nobody. Bad grammar, I know, but that's what they say. Don't need women. Don't need to settle down. Don't need roots. They leave. What's missing then? Again, I'll try to make this real short. In the Odyssey, we know there's a big test. The husband and wife, Penelope and Odysseus, are testing each other back and forth because it's really dangerous to bring in an imposter. The imposter could kill you. The imposter could steal everything in your house. So Penelope is very strategic. She's got a number of tests. The bow test, the bed test, they're famous, big motif in Western art for 2,000 years now. Once they finally reconcile, there's a beautiful passage translated in different ways, but essentially Odysseus and Penelope go to bed after 20 years and they share their joy in love. It's very simply written, but here comes the catch. And this, I hope this fructifies for you and your listeners and your conferences. I had to argue to keep this in my book, because originally my editors couldn't find the original translation. But in one, Butcher and Lang from the 1867, that's how long ago, they've made love. Penelope turns to her husband, says, "Come tell me of thine ordeal, because my heart can take it." This is a fierce, fierce line. She says, don't hold back. Tell me, if you had an affair, there are rumors about you out there, right? But you felt badly and you lost. You come home alone. Where are all our men? Where's the crew? Tell me of your ordeals. And then one of the great statements by any women character in Western literature: my heart can take it. Don't think I'm too weak just because I'm a woman. I can take it. And then, like most men, Odysseus kind of rolls his shoulders, sitting next to her in bed, begins to tell her about the Trojan War, all the adventures coming home. Then he does something, frankly, that most men have forgotten to do ever since. Odysseus turns to his wife, Penelope, and says, "Now you tell me of your ordeals." Yeah, it must have been hard for you to raise our son all alone. It must have been horrifying for you to deal with these 108 suitors who have been eating us out of house and home, who really want to get into your bed. They've been pretending that I've been dead. How did you deal with all this? Here's the kicker. Then he listens. Ian, he listens to her. And the line in the various translations is, they talked and listened to each other until dawn. Stupefying. Because usually the relationship is like this, right? The man talks, the woman listens. Or the man puts up with the wife. Here, Homer, it's called homosophrene. I'm pretty sure that's the pronunciation. What it means is the ability for a man and a woman, or two lovers in a situation, to treat each other as absolute equals. So they ask and then they listen. They tell and they listen. This emotional payoff after 20 years of separation, for me, is missing in the movie. That's very subtle. It's just taken me 2,000 or 3,000 words to tell that story. That would have been hard to convey. But my point is, you need an emotional and soulful payoff after your heroes, the man and the woman, have been separated for 20 years. And there's no such thing in the movie. Instead, the mythic message is disappear. I've been a hero. I'm going away. And I don't really need home. But that's mystifying because he's been thinking about nothing other than the land, his son, his wife. And then at the end of the movie, he leaves. But that itself is mythic. That's what we're telling each other. We're telling each other that to men throughout the Western world, you don't need male friends. You don't even need to hang out with your son. You can go away with your wife, but you'll probably leave her too. You see what I'm getting at here? It's a curious message, but it's working for certain portions of the population. When I wear my Odyssey sweatshirt, here, I was in Los Angeles last week, in San Diego, many places around California. I get young men coming up to me and their eyes are dilating, Ian. They're dilating. They say, "Oh man, I love that poem. I love that book." And that movie, I've seen it 5 times. One young guy said to me, another young man with his girlfriends said, he's seen this 5 times. What is happening there other than young people are seeing themselves in Nolan's version of the Odyssey? And that in itself, that's a miraculous thing.
Well, I'm sure we could go on for a long, long time, and it would be very rich and wonderful. And for this conversation, as we wind to a close, the listeners are invited to check out your full book that you've spent a great labor of love on, The Wisdom of the Odyssey, 24 Life Lessons from Homer's Epic. And once again, thank you, Phil, for the time here and just beautifully unfolding it for me. And yeah, what would you like to leave a listener with?
Just one more thing. Please go back to the original. Find, to the viewers, to people in your conferences, find the translation that sings to you. Sing is an important verb here. If one doesn't appeal, feels too Gothic or too Victorian, drop it. Go find another one. You've got, my favorite is Lattimore. The new translation by Emily Wilson is the first ever by a woman. It's shorter, it's brisker, it moves very quickly. The old translations are described as echoing of the oars of the Greek sailors in the water. That's the rhythm of the original Greek. That staggers me. Emily Wilson's version is in iambic pentameter, Shakespeare's pentameter, and it moves like a chariot, it moves very quickly. So find one that sings to you, then read my book if you can, and then see the movie. And finally, I'm leading another tour to Greece in the footsteps of Homer at the end of September, and another one next spring. So if you read this, you see the movie, you are hypnotized, spellbound by it, join us in Greece next year.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phil. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Mythic Masculine. If you enjoyed what you heard, please share this episode with your friends and post on social media. Subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. And once again, check out themythicmasculine.com for my upcoming in-person and online offerings. Until next time.